Good evening, welcome to this Tuesday evening session of Finnish Society of Natural Philosophy. We have today as speaker Martín López-Corredoira. He is Doctor of Philosophy in Physics and both philosophy. He works as staff researcher at Instituto de Astrofísica de Canarias, Canary Islands, Spain. He is author of more than 100 papers on astrophysics in international referred scientific journals, half of them as the first author. He is also author of tens of articles and papers on philosophy and several books including Against the Tide, a critical review by scientists of how physics and astronomy get done, University Publishers 2008, with co-editor C. Castro Perelman. Then The Twilight of the Scientific Age, John Walker Press 2013. Fundamental Ideas in Cosmology, Scientific, Philosophical and Sociological Critical Perspectives, IOP Science 2022. Diversity, Inclusion, Equity and the Threat to Academic Freedom, Imprint Academic 2022, with co-editor editors T. H.C. Olson. So, Martin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Very glad to be here. In a place in which I suppose many of you are interested in science and also in philosophical questions. And my talk will be about both questions, about science, philosophy of science, and philosophy in general. I will offer some point of view. I understand that in philosophy, most of the things are points of view. There are very few objective things. Some point of view about the panorama of science nowadays that I have called the Twilight, to remark some pessimistic view of the panorama of science nowadays. We are told many times that our times is something like a golden age of science, because nowadays there are many scientists, more than ever. There are millions of scientists nowadays doing research. There are many papers. We publish more papers than ever, many conferences dedicated to science. Even in the general public, not the professional, the general public has high interest for science also, more than ever. You can see in the mass media, there are news published almost every week, every day about fantastic discoveries of science. So just having a look superficially about science from the sociological point of view, one may conclude that we live a fantastic epoch of science nowadays, in the 21st century. However, I would like to remind, and this is the point of my talk here, that science is not about producing, and it's not a factory. It's not like producing cars or making houses. No, the important thing in science is the ideas. And the question to do about science, to evaluate whether our science is good or not, is about the quality of the ideas. Are we producing some new revolutions in science, some new worldviews? Something that gives sense to our existence in some way, because we should not forget the origins of science. Science is a branch of philosophy, it's natural philosophy. And everything in philosophy is not gratuitous, it has some purpose. It's related with our existence, with our role here in the universe. We want to understand where do we come from, what is the origin of everything. These are philosophical questions. And science has contributed enormously to our civilization, to our Western civilization, to these questions, at least in the past. Are we now in the same situation? Is providing science, and here I want to remark, I'm talking about fundamental science, not applied science. Applied science, we know, is very useful because with this we can make new materials, we can build new computers faster than ever. This is very useful, but I'm talking about the intellectual point of view of science, our knowledge. Are we producing in the last century in science new revolutions that can become the most important thing ever in the history of science? This is my question. Take the glasses. Talking about the sense, let me start with a quotation by a Spanish philosopher, Miguel de Unamuno, who said more than 1 century ago, 1913, he says something like that. Yes, I see it. A huge social activity, a powerful civilization, a lot of science, a lot of art, a lot of industry, a lot of morality, and then when we have filled the world with industrial wonders, with large factories, with paths, with museums, with libraries, we will fall down exhausted near all this, and it will be for whom? Was man made for science, or science made for man? Says Unamuno. It's an important question that is valid even nowadays, even more than 1 century ago, because we see a huge effort of the societies. We are investing a lot of science. The thing is this science will be useful, not in a practical sense, but for our wisdom. It will be useful for us as proportional to the effort that we are doing to do this science. Will be the question. We have to understand which is the sense of making science. We are not machines. We are not robots. We make science, or we make art, or we make something because we want to express something as a society. We want to understand something. There should be some goal, not just producing employment, just moving the money. This is capitalism, but this is not science. This is not the goal. Creating new employment, this is not the goal of science. The goal of science is chasing new truths that illuminate our existence. It's a philosophical proposal. All manifestations of culture throughout the history of humanity has some purpose, has some sense. One can compare something very different, as I do here. Is there more sense in building particle accelerators than in building pyramids, for instance, in the past? Possibly even these two different things are related. Both things try to find something eternal in humanity. In the ancient Egypt, the pharaohs built these big pyramids because they have the belief that they will survive to death, and they will have the eternity with these pyramids. Nowadays, we are building some big construction in our science just with the belief that we are building some knowledge which will be eternal. And this is a relief for our pain, because our pain is that we have to recognize that we are going to die someday, as individuals and as a society. So this, in some sense, this effort of science to get eternal truth is like a consolation for the fact, the painful fact that we have to recognize that our lives are finite. It's some kind of psychological explanation why we are so interested in chasing the truth. Although there is some illusion in this idea of eternal. There is nothing eternal in culture. The only thing eternal in human beings, I mean, not in the universe, but in the human beings, as far as we exist, are the biological functions. But from the anthropological point of view, each civilization and each epoch has different values. I agree. I'm not, in my case, I am not a postmodern relativist. I agree that science is providing some absolute truths about the universe. I can recognize that. However, we must bear in mind that these truths are not interesting for everybody. Not all societies are interested in these truths. For instance, just one historical example, is well known, for instance, that in the Middle Age, in the Western countries, the interest for science was not as much as the interest of the Greek, the ancient Greece, for instance, for science. There was some decline of the interest for science. The interesting thing in the Middle Age in Western Europe was mostly religion, and everything which was connected with religion. Theology, philosophy, connected with religion, but science, if it is not connected with religion, was not so important. This is just one. There are plenty of examples, not only in the Western countries. We can mention also other civilizations that have been living without science, without fundamental science, and however, they are advanced civilizations. So this idea that all civilizations should have interest in science, well, is not true. Not all civilizations. And possibly in the future, it's not impossible, our civilization will lose the interest for making new discoveries in the universe. The universe is there, of course, nobody denies that, but why we should make so much effort to have big catalogs of galaxies and all the particles of the universe, making a catalog of all the 16 forms. There are other ways of expressing our culture. Science is not everything. So this is the question. Is it possible that in the future there will be no science in our society? It's a question. I'm not giving the answer. It's a question. It is true that if we go to the past, there was a time in which a land in Egypt in which it has sense to build big pyramids. Now, nobody builds big pyramids in Egypt. What for? We will say. There was a time in Europe in which it has sense to build big cathedrals. Nowadays, it's not the time of big cathedrals in Europe. There are exceptions. In my country, in Barcelona, for instance, there is Sagrada Familia, but it's an exception. It's not the time of big cathedrals now in Europe. This time is over, has passed. Now we have the time in which we build big telescopes, big particle accelerators, and this is another manifestation of our culture. It's not the absolute culture, I will say. Possibly in the future, in few centuries, people will say, why we should build big telescopes and big accelerators? This has no sense now. Now our sense will go in another direction. The sense is what makes the root of our activities as a culture, because cultures are not machines. It's not that you insert some software and you produce something. No, we have motivations, and the motivation to do science now is not the same thing that was 5 centuries ago or what will be in the future. Let me say a few things, because I have no time to discuss many historical examples, few things about big important revolutions in science that were very important. Why science was so important for the Western civilization? Because it has replied some philosophical questions which were very important for our society. One important revolution undoubtedly was the heliocentric revolution. It was a heroic struggle against false beliefs to put our position in the universe as it is, the Earth around the Sun and not the opposite. And it was also the purpose of understanding our position in the universe. Of course, the heliocentric model nowadays is obsolete. We have a model of the universe which is much wider. We have now galaxies and many other things. But the idea is the same. It's understanding which is our position in the universe. Humanity finds this very interesting. Just for the existential point of view, for the philosophical point of view. So this kind of science was very important for the civilization, not for physics alone, but for all our culture, understanding which is our position, that we are not the center of the universe. Another example of big science, what I call really big science, is the question, what is the universe made of? What is matter? And there were many philosophical and scientific discussions during many centuries in many civilizations until we reached more or less at the beginning of 20th century some clear idea of what is matter, and we have now the atomic theory, which is a quite solid theory about what is matter. Matter is not something continuous; it's composed by particles, and there are subparticles, and all this. This is a great achievement in science. Something that at present what we are doing is not comparable. You know? Here I have a quotation by Per Bak, is a physicist. And he expresses, most particle physicists think they are still doing science when they are really cleaning up the mess after the party. What we are doing now is second order science. It's not first class science compared with what was done at the beginning of 20th century. Of course, we invest a lot of money. The only thing that I am impressed by the particle accelerators nowadays and the achievements of the CERN and other big places for science is the huge amount of money that they are able to spend in a short time. This is quite impressive, but when they say, we have discovered some tentative detection of a new particle, well, what is this compared with all the atomic theory, the quantum mechanics, the relativity, all that was created in the beginning of 20th century? It's something, a minor science, it's a lower quality science. We can discuss because, well, as I was discussing with the organizer before, one can ask which is the criterion to decide what is good science and what is not good science. We can discuss about this. At present, I am expressing some point of view which is not my unique point of view. I mean, there are other people that share this point of view that can be understood with some examples. It's clear that the science, the physics, in the beginning of 20th century was much more important. The first 20, 30 years of the 20th century are much more important than what was produced in the last 50 or 60 years, without doubt, from a historical point of view, philosophical, scientific, etc. Science could understand the logic of motion, the development of mechanics, the Newton's law, the Maxwell, the quantum mechanics, the relativity. So we understand a lot of things about nature. The question is, once we know the most fundamental things, what is the mission of science now? Of course, some people will say there are still things to discover. For instance, still we are pending of a unification of physics, if we reach this unification of physics. But if we look at the past, we can see that it's huge and very important, the science that is in the past. And the perspective for the science in the future is, well, I cannot say about the future, but the science in the last 50 years, I will say, is not so impressive as the science in the previous century. About the future, maybe tomorrow we have a new Einstein, or we have a new theory that produces a new revolution. But just if we extrapolate what was happening in the last 50, 60, 70 years in science, we see that there is some kind of the decline of great achievements in science. Not only in physics, these are a few examples, few famous examples in physics, but of course there are other science with different developments and different epochs. Biology, for instance, one of the most important, I think all the philosophers, historians of science may agree that one of the most important discoveries or developments, or theoretical developments in biology is the ideas by Darwin and Wallace about the natural selection and evolution and the origin of man, because it's important not only for biologists. The impact of this scientific theory for the rest of the society is enormous, because it replies questions, fundamental questions of who are we, where do we come from. They are indeed fundamental philosophical questions. It's not pure technical science for scientists, it's science for a society. And this is why it is so important, the development of Darwin. Another example within biology, think about during 150 years, more or less, between 1820 and 1960, this period, 1 century and a half, there was a huge development of biochemistry, molecular biology, genetics. It was incredible, the amount of huge discoveries in this epoch that has produced something very important. We could understand life. We could understand life in terms of physics and chemistry. It's a thing that at the beginning of 19th century, people, philosophers, scientists, thought that vitalism was the explanation for life. There was not any scientific explanation for life. And now we have an explanation how life works. Still, we have some lagoons, the origin of life, for instance, but the fundamental mechanism of life, we understand it. And what are we doing nowadays in the last 50 years comparable with this? It's minor things in the fundamental science. Of course, we are doing something very important, applications of science. For instance, the genome project is a big project with billions of dollars, and it's very useful for applications for medicine. But our understanding of life, our understanding of genetics is not much higher than 50 years ago. The fundamental questions have been solved already around half a century ago. Is there any way, objective way to evaluate this decrease of quality of science, or not quality only in the technical thing, but the impact of science, I will say? Well, some people have tried it. Recently, this is a paper published last year by Park et al. In Nature, the journal Nature, in which they measure a parameter which is called disruptive parameter, this parameter CD5, and they compare different sciences. This parameter is connected with the citations of a paper, and if a paper is very disruptive, this means that it is the first one. It's a pioneer paper, and everybody cites this paper, but this paper does not cite the previous one. So there are some techniques, bibliometric techniques, just to measure this parameter. Well, they conclude, as you can see in the left, that in many sciences, the life sciences, physical science, even social sciences, this disruptive parameter is getting down, which explains in other terms, we are making some continuation, we are repeating the science. Of course, we have better technique, we have better computers, and we are producing a lot of papers, but we are not producing new ideas. This is what is reflecting this map. Also in the patents, something similar is happening. This plot can be repeated only with the best science. For instance, if we select the science made by Nobel Prizes, you can see how there is a decrease also in the last century. No? These are the 600 papers connected with some Nobel Prizes, and the disruptivity, that is this parameter that measures the impact and the novelty. Something, when you say something really new, not a continuation of something that was done in the past, but something really new. In the beginning of 20th century, there were many things that were really new, and nowadays we are frying again the same things, just with new aspect, but it's just a continuation. This is what they say. It's also plotted here in the journals Science, Nature, and PNAS, the same trend. So there are ways, if we want to evaluate this numerically, but we don't need numbers for that. Anybody thinks that quantum mechanics is not more important than the other things, the discovery of the Higgs boson, for instance, or this minor thing? No, quantum mechanics is much, much more important. And this, we have nothing produced in the same level of quality nowadays in science. Not only the the quality or the level or the impact of the science was much higher in the past, but also from an economical point of view, we can say that it was cheaper, was much cheaper for our societies. We can examine many cases, here I put only 3 examples, but there are many other cases, that illustrate that the best science produced ever was very cheap for our society. For instance, here I mentioned Darwin. Darwin never had a remunerated academic position. Even the trip in the Beagle, during 5 years to South America, he paid himself this trip. No, the state has not paid him with any budget dedicated to research. So the discoveries by Darwin were indeed very, very cheap for our states, for our societies. Another example I put here, this is from my country. Ramón y Cajal is one of the parents of neuroscience, the discovering of the neurons. The first years of research by Ramón y Cajal were done at home with a microscope that he bought with his own pocket. So very, very cheap the science produces in the 19th century compared with nowadays that we need to spend millions and millions of dollars just to make tiny things. This is the discovery of neurons. It's something very important. And of course, everybody knows Einstein and the famous case of the publication in 1905 of the 3 famous papers that were very, very cheap for our society because Einstein produces this in the free time while he was working in a patent office. So he has not a position as a researcher. Later, we know that in Princeton, in the last 20 years of his career, was working in the US with a good position. And he produces nothing important, by the way. But the thing that I want to point out is that making good science is not equivalent to investing a lot of money. Sometimes the best science is very cheap. This is my lemma, what I wanted to remark, how cheap was the best science in the past. No? Can we make statistics numbers about that? Well, it's not so easy because there are different parameters, but we can make some rough estimations. For instance, we can just check in some papers about sociology and history of science. We know that the number of scientists in the 19th century, during 100 years, the whole period, it was around 100,000 researchers. They were not professional researchers. Most of them were people that published only 1 paper in life, and they were not paid for this activity. Possibly they have other economical activities. So these people were very cheap for our society. And the instruments and all this was much, much cheaper what was produced nowadays. At present, this statistic is 10 years old, but I think has not changed much. At present, we have 6 million professional researchers, I mean with salary. 6 million researchers making research nowadays that are living from science. You can say, of course, the population in the 19th century was lower than at present, but even compensating with the factor, the ratio of researchers at those times was much lower. In this, I put there the ratio 4 times 10 to minus 5 was the ratio of scientists compared with the population in 19th century. And nowadays we have 1 researcher every 1,000 people. And this is the average around the world. If you go to the developed countries like the US, maybe it's 1 in 200 or so. So we have plenty of scientists. We have scientists everywhere. Not all of them are dedicated to fundamental science. Many of them are in the medical industry, pharmaceutical, other things that have some applications. But at least 20% are doing fundamental research in science. The total cost of research and development nowadays, or 10 years ago, was $1 trillion per year. This is the total cost of research nowadays, which is 1.6% of the total GDP of the world. Both in absolute and relative terms, the society is spending much more money now, much more effort in science than ever. However, the quality of the science is not better than ever. So my conclusion, again, is science is more and more expensive to produce less and less important results. This is the trend. I don't know how will be the future. I'm not a prophet. But if we make an extrapolation of this trend, and we see that science is becoming more and more and more expensive, and the results of the science are less and less and less important, there will be a moment in which there will be a big crisis in science. People will say, of course, if we cannot increase the cost of the telescopes or the particle accelerators, we cannot continue doing science, so we have to close research institutes. This is predictable. When this will happen, I don't know, maybe in 50 years, maybe in 1 century, I have no idea. But if we continue with this dependence of the economy cannot grow exponentially. This is like Malthus. The necessities of the scientists grow exponentially, but the economy does not grow exponentially, so the resources are not infinite to do science. So we cannot increase our science just putting more and more money. This will be the collapse of science someday. Let me illustrate how this has been working, for instance, in my own research field. I am an astronomer, I do astrophysics. Here I put a couple of telescopes. In the left, you can see the most important telescope built in the beginning of 20th century, which is the 200-inch Mount Palomar in the US, which has produced a lot of good science, very important science during the 20th century. Possibly much better science than what we are producing nowadays. The cost of this telescope was, in that time, around $6 million. This cost $6 million. If we correct with inflation, the inflation term, compared, of course, in the 50s, in the 40s, the life was cheaper than now, but even correcting of inflation, this will be equivalent to around $60 million nowadays. This will be the equivalence, the cost of the society to build this telescope. Well, what is the equivalent nowadays? Nowadays, we are building a much more expensive telescope. This is the EELT, is the European Large Telescope, which a cost of 10 up to 9 is 1 billion euros. 1 billion euros plus the maintenance. You have every year you have to spend a lot of money also to maintain the operations of this telescope. But this is not the most expensive device that we have nowadays. We have, for instance, the Space Telescope, this American Space Telescope. Well, it's an international collaboration indeed, it's not only American. The Space Telescope, the James Webb, and the cost is $10 billion, the cost of this telescope. So it's, if you compare with the telescope only 60 or 70 years ago, we are multiplying, even correcting of inflation and everything, we are multiplying by a factor almost 200 or so, the cost of the instruments. And the quality of science is not much better. It's an incremental science. We are knowing new galaxies, we are observing the universe very far, but it's not a revolutionary science. So, which will be the destination of astronomy if we continue this trend? Are we going to spend 100 times more money in the future telescope to put a telescope in the moon with 100 meters? It's not affordable. Society cannot afford this huge amount of money. So if science cannot be increased with putting some limit in the resource, science will collapse. We cannot. Particle accelerators have already reached this limit. In the CERN, for instance, they are in the limit of what they can spend, and this is why most particle physicists think that they cannot produce anything more, because there is no more money to build something larger than that. In astronomy, still we can increase a little bit the expenses, but it's not infinite. $10 billion is a huge expense only for doing fundamental science. Again, well, I repeat the lemma, the science is more and more expensive to produce less and less important results. Some people may claim, they say, okay, but it's fun, the discoveries of the James Webb are fantastic, and I agree. I am an astronomer. I'm using the data of James Webb. I'm delighted with this telescope. It's fantastic. It's the best thing that we have ever built. However, I doubt that we are producing a new revolution in science. sometimes we are going back instead of getting a progress in science. Now we are, thanks to the James Webb, we are discovering that many things that were claimed in the past were wrong. Now James Webb is emphasizing that, for instance, we are observing that there are many massive galaxies at the beginning of the universe, even all galaxies at the beginning of the universe. It could not be. So we are going back. We thought in the past, we were very optimistic that we thought we have a complete theory of the cosmos, and now James Webb is making us realize that we were not as good, but it's not producing any advance in science in this. Let's go to other aspects of science. Few aspects, as I said, my talk is limited. Even possibly I will talk too much, but there are many things to observe in science. From a sociological point of view, imagine you are an observer, a sociologist, observing scientists, how science is being produced nowadays. Don't forget that science is something human, and everything human has the characteristics of any human society. We are not machines. One of the characteristics that I observe, not only in my career, but in many other aspects, is that most of the work done, the heavy work in science is done by PhD students and postdocs. So they are the manpower, they are the cheap manpower, the equivalent to the slaves in the past. No? Because a grant for a student is very cheap, much cheaper than a professor, and you can convince him to work. Because we are in a capitalist system, you say you have to work because in order to get your curriculum and to get the next grant. Otherwise you become an outsider. So it's very easy to convince a young person to work hard. The problem with this system, in my opinion, is that creativity among young people is not encouraged. So most of these young researchers have no time to produce their own ideas because they spend most of the time doing the manpower, the heavy task, making a lot of programs and a lot of laboratory activities or whatever. And they need to have a curriculum in order to survive in the scientific system. So this is how it works, the capitalist science nowadays. Yeah, this is terrible for science for one question, because if you observe the history of science, most of the most important discoveries have been made by young people, because young people have a fresh mind, they can produce new ideas. A person who has been spending 30, 40 years in their life doing the same thing, it's very difficult that they can reset their machine and start new ideas. They will continue what they have started when they were young, but not producing something totally new. New ideas should become from young scientists, in general, with few exceptions. And I emphasize, ideas is the most important thing of science, not producing papers, not organizing conferences. It's producing ideas and facts, also experiments and observations. So this is another problem that I see in science nowadays. And what happened with the senior scientists? Senior scientists also have no time to think about science. This is the paradox nowadays, because most of them spend most of their time doing administration of science, what I call. No? Let me read this quotation by Donald Gillies, who is a philosopher of science, but I think it's quite good observation. No? It's not only about science, regrettably it's about academia in general, but this in particular is how the science is organized nowadays. Academics typically start with great enthusiasm for research, but after a number of years working at research, they often become rather bored with it. They may have run out of ideas. They may have come to realize that their youthful hopes of becoming the next Einstein were an illusion, while the reality is that there are quite a number of young researchers doing better than they are. In these circumstances, the sensible move is into administration and management, where a tempting career later stretches before them. So this is when you start to apply for an ERC grant and you become a member of the committee of whatever, but you don't do science. So we have a situation that young people do a lot of tasks but have no time to think, and all people do a lot of administration and have a lot of students around, but they also have no time to think about science. So, of course, yes, we have many scientists and we produce something, even something relatively important, but the organization is terrible. The efficiency of this system to produce science is terrible. About the publication system, as you know, everybody knows that there is a system of journals, peer-reviewed journals, and this is the way how the scientists communicate their results. The peer review system has some advantages because it filters the bad science and can correct many rubbish of science. So we get a science with a minimum of quality. So the best journals produce some science with a minimum of quality. The problem is that when somebody tries to publish some revolutionary idea in these journals, it's also filtered. So it's some way to reject the best and the minimum. It's some way to establish a mediocre level of science. It's protected in the top and in the bottom in some way. It is, I have no time to discuss this, and not even less to talk about criterion to select what is correct or not, but there are plenty of literature, not written by me, by many sociologists, historians of science, showing that there are evidences that the peer review system is not the best way to select the best sciences. And there are many experiments in the sense that some people can send a paper just was rubbish on purpose just to see how is the reaction of the referee, and this paper is published in the end. There are plenty of experiments with this kind that demonstrate that it's not the best way to do it. It's true that we have a problem in science, that we are too many scientists and we are producing a lot. We need a filter, otherwise we saturate the system, and this is the way to protect the academia, just making science only for few people, otherwise everybody can publish something. No? But it's something, a necessity of the organization of science, but not a necessity of science. The second problem itself is connected, as I say. The problem is that we have too many papers, a huge number of papers nowadays. Nobody has time to read so many papers. This is the problem. Even the specialist in a very narrow field has no time to read everything what is written by the colleagues. Here in this plot that I show there in the top right, you see this is a logarithmic scale in the vertical, and in the horizontal axis you have the year. It's almost an exponential decrease of the number of publications in science. You can see that at the beginning of 20th century, in all fields of science, there were around 20,000 papers per year published, 20,000 per year. Nowadays, we publish around 10 million papers per year in all fields, biology, physics, everything. And this is still increasing. This is the question. Of course, we are producing too much. And the problem is that even if there is one paper which is revolutionary there, people will not realize, because it's very difficult. People have no time to read the papers. So even if somebody is able to pass the filters of the journals and publish a revolutionary idea, maybe nobody will realize of it because it's lost among the amount of information. This happens also in academia in general, not only in science. In the opinion of Schreer, who is a physicist, clearly the aim behind such mass publication was not to clarify a scientific problem, but rather to be on the side of a career-supporting trend, leading possibly, at least for some, to grants, fame, and prizes. So we have converted science in an economic activity, in a capitalist activity, that the important thing is producing and producing. It doesn't matter what we produce, but the important thing are the numbers, producing and more producing. But this is not good for science either. Another aspect among many that we can remark here, these are only few, is that individual science is less and less frequent. In the past, this is my field, for instance, astrophysics, in this table in the left. 50 years ago, in the 1970s, around almost 60% of the papers were written with one author, only one single author, and only 1% of the papers has 6 or more co-authors. Look at the same numbers at the 2018, 5 years ago. We have almost inverted. Only 11% of the papers are produced by one author, and 34% of the papers are big groups, 6 or more co-authors. I have nothing against the big collaborations. It's good for science and it's necessary because there are some activities that require a lot of work. And it's good that we have big collaborations. But we should not forget that the important science is the ideas, and the ideas are produced by individuals. The brain is something individual. We cannot connect 3, 4, 5 people to produce one idea. The idea is produced by individuals. Of course, one guy can produce an idea and other people can work for this idea. This may work. But usually the most relevant papers with some revolutionary ideas are papers with 1, 2 co-authors, 3 co-authors. I do not believe that we can make big science in a paper with 400 co-authors, for instance. This is technical work. This is work for engineers. There are no new ideas in a paper of this category, which is what is constituting most of the activity nowadays. Why this happens? Well, this is something sociological. It's how the funds are distributed in science. Nowadays, I have to be pessimistic, and I have to say that even if you try to do this individual science, you will not be successful, because science has become a machine without soul, I will say. We are not controlling our science. We can make a comparison with a nuclear reaction, for instance. In order to trigger a reaction in a reactor, you need a critical mass. Because in science, it's working like that. You need a critical mass of money and people. If one individual alone has fantastic ideas, but you have not the support of a big organization behind with a lot of money, this is negligible compared with the rest of the reality. It doesn't matter. Maybe your theory is correct and the theory of other people is not correct. But science nowadays is not about the truth. Science is a sociological movement. It's an activity. It's an economical activity. It's disconnected. In the past, maybe it was more connected with the idea of search of the truth. Nowadays, it's not the search of the truth. It's the search of money, getting big grants, and putting a machine to work in some direction. Science is more and more institutionalized every day, which means less freedom to explore new ideas because the organizations have some hierarchy. There is more money than ever, which is good for some things, especially because we can build very expensive experiments. But remember that money always prefers safety. Money does not like risk, and science is about taking risk. You cannot present a project, give me some money because possibly in 20 years I will discover something. No, you have to promise something that you will discover for sure, even if it is a rubbish science, but money prefers safety. If you want to convince the politicians and the society about some project, you have to say something for sure, not something risky about some possible revolution in science within 20 years. Society is drowned in ideas and information without assimilating most of them. As I said, we have too many publications, too much activity that does not allow to see what is important, what not. We are creating monocultures of big communities with rigid research agenda, which moreover we have the peer pressure and the job market prospects that all together makes a machinery which has some similarity with other systems within the capitalist system. We have a blind system. Now, capitalism is something blind. Nobody is touching one button. Nobody controls the capitalism. But science is becoming blind in the same sense. There is some kind of a snowball effect in which the people who have more money gets even more money and more students and goes in more direction, just with the purpose of growing for the purpose of growing, not for making interesting science. Young scientists are usually discouraged to explore new ideas with the threat of being away from the system. If you don't produce a lot of papers, you have to publish 3-4 papers in 3 years during your PhD. Otherwise, you cannot get a postdoc and you cannot continue your career. This is how it works. And of course, there are people who make science outsiders, many amateurs or even professional scientists that try to do their own science, but this is not better. They produce noise, I will say, because among them, the tons of papers, even we have among 1,000 papers produced by one amateur, there is one which is worth to read, but given the bad reputation that amateurs have in science, professional scientists do not pay attention to them simply. They ignore. Even they have no time to read the papers produced by professional scientists, even less by amateurs. So this is something that is lost forever. Most of the papers are lost forever, even if they are fantastic ideas. But also, I would like to say that many heterodox cosmologists or physicists or scientists in general still think in the science how was produced in the past. They live the illusion of the times of Einstein, that you can produce in the patent office an article. They are comparable to Quixote, like the character of my country, the novel by Cervantes, that they think they live in a world with fantastic ideals, and you have to collaborate to the production of these ideas. No, the world is not about that. The world nowadays is dominated by money and by power and by other political interests, not by ideals. And trying to fight along against all this system is just being a Quixote, no? In some sense. I'm quite pessimistic in many aspects, and I have no time to develop everything. But let me summarize my 3 most important points here, because I have told many ideas. First, one important problem in science nowadays, in fundamental science. I'm always talking about fundamental science. Applied science is another thing, because you have applications, it's another story. Science for the sake of science. So the problem is that first, society is drowned in huge amount of knowledge, most of it being about things of little importance, producing no significant advances, but only technical application or secondary details. Second, in the few fields where some important aspects of unsolved questions have arisen, powerful groups control the flow of information and push toward consensus truths rather than having objective discussions within a scientific methodology, which gives few guarantees that we are obtaining solid new truths about nature. Third, individual creativity is condemned to disappear in favor of big corporations, of administrators and politicians of science, specialized in searching ways to get money from states in megaprojects with increasing costs and diminishing returns. There are many other aspects, and here I will mention also a few of them. For instance, the aspect of bureaucracy. Have you realized it, not only in science, but also in philosophy, I suppose, in academia in general? People spend more, not only the secretaries and the administrators, but the academicians and the researchers are spending more and more time of their work doing filling papers, they're doing administration rather than thinking about science. And this is quite common in many countries, not only here. I remark in Spain, but I think it's not Spain the only case. So bureaucracy is taking the place of thinking about ideas. We have also ideology. Here I put an example, a recent example. In my opinion, we are exceeding the amount of propaganda connected with gender ideology or woke ideology or whatever in the academia. Academia is not a place to spread political propaganda. However, it's true that scientists need money, and the way to get money is go to the politicians. And politicians, they don't care about science. They want just power. And so they use science to spread their propaganda in some sense. This is exactly what happened in the old Soviet Union. We know the case of Lysenko or other historical cases in which the politicians use science to make propaganda of some ideological system. And this is happening nowadays, unfortunately. Science is also, well, here not only fundamental, of course, in general, is contributed to a world anti-ecological with more and more contamination, a bourgeois science, so scientists are not the free thinkers of the past that were fighting for new ideas. No, most of the scientists have a good salary and good lives, and their goal in their lives is not discovering a new truth, but having a new house and having a wife and a dog, and a bourgeois life. So we have converted science in something to create some status in our society. So many people is living from science. Last but not least, I would like to remark one aspect if you have not realized it. Science in the past was different from the science now because it belongs to different values of a different culture. Now we are dominated by the Anglo-Saxon culture. This is not good or bad, it's just it's something different. Particularly North American values. After the Second World War, science has become a reflection of the ideals of the North American values, no? Which are quite pragmatic. For the ideal of the pragmatic philosophy will be truth is whatever it gives money. This is the dilemma of somebody who is pragmatic. Here I give a quotation of a book published last year, not by me, by another person, by Alexander Unziker, talking about, well, the book was called Make Physics Great Again, America Has Failed. The rationale behind these supposedly scientific data factories is similar to that of the capitalist economy, and like the latter, fails to think in terms of long-term horizons. Investments in big assets must yield their returns in the form of results, with the Nobel Prize, of course, as the main asset, not because the accolade for scientific insight is valued as such, but because it has increasingly become a prerequisite for government funding. The important thing is getting funding for science. For a scientist who wants to make a career, the important thing is getting money. It's a factory. We have converted science in a factory. Here I give some general characteristics, not for all particulars, but general characteristics. How was the science before 1945? My impression. Of course, there are many exceptions. Typical classical physicists, for instance, before 1945, were not only scientists, they were philosopher scientists. Many of them have with interest for philosophy, interest in history of ideas, wide culture, view of general problems of physics as a whole, individual work rather than working in big groups, skills in mathematics and fundamental physics, interested in discussing fundamental ideas of a science. Many of them were critical, skeptical, etc. How is the situation nowadays? And even becoming worse with the next generations. This is not a continuous, it's not an abrupt transition, it's a continuous that is changing towards another direction. Nowadays we are dominated in science by scientists that are very, very specialized. They know a lot about science, but they are ignorant of history, ignorant of philosophy. The only thing they know about philosophy, most of them, is just Occam's razor and Popper's falsationism, and this is whatever the rest of the thing. They never cite any idea in philosophy. Hyper-specialized, big science, most of the people, of large group collaborations, skills in computers and technology and administration of scientific projects, rather than skills in physics and mathematics, uninterested in discussing fundamental ideas of science, lack of critical approach, lack of skepticism, and overall we have become cynical and pragmatic businessmen, as used to say in the US, business as usual. I'm, 10 more minutes and I finish, because otherwise we have no time to discuss. Yes, one. The situation is quite pessimistic. Well, many of you are interested, or you are professional philosophers, and you can say, well, possibly this is because philosophers need to do something in science to recover the spirit of science, the true spirit. Let me add a few notes, pessimistic notes also about philosophy of science, and also at the same time to claim that, of course, philosophy is important, and I recommend everybody to read philosophy, but especially classical philosophers. If you want to learn how to think and how to have develop your intelligence, better spend your time in reading classical philosophers. Philosophy of science nowadays, well, is useful for other philosophers of science, but not for scientists. Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize of Physics, uses to say that philosophy of science is about as useful to scientists as ornithology is to birds. We are not going to do, we scientists, we are not going to do better science if you explain me all the details of the methodology. We already know all the things of the detail. We don't waste time just with the methodology of science. This is something that we know since our early formation. These discussions about relativism and constructivism or language analysis, falsifiability, these are not useful for a scientist, to do a better science. This is just an excuse to make curriculum to be in a department of philosophy of science, simply, but this is not important philosophy. What is important is just to read the important philosophers, the general philosophers who have discussed about everything. More remarkable, I would like to say that the problems that are present in science are present in academia in general. So the sociological problems about the peer review system, the excess of publications, the administration of dedication to administration rather than to doing research or thinking is the same in philosophy or history or in sciences. It's something global. So this is why it's not usually discussed by the young philosophers. They are more interested in the methodology. But let me just put a few examples among many that I have no time to tell you that, yes, philosophy is useful just to think, to understand in which world you are living. And don't forget that scientists are human beings, are in this world, are not extraterrestrials. First, for instance, just one example, the famous Nietzsche, no? Everybody, I think, knows him. He's a very famous philosopher, the most influential philosopher in the 20th century, I would say. But what's happened here? Something happened? No. Maybe I have touched it. Go. Yes. He said, men crowd to the light not to see better, but to become more brilliant. When we become bright enough, other people will consider us as lights. Why do we try to demonstrate the truth? Because of a broader feeling of power, because of its utility, because it is indispensable, summing up in order to gain some advantage. But this is a bias, a signal which indicates that deep down we do not worry about the truth. One of the contributions of Nietzsche is just waking up us from the Enlightenment dream. In the 18th century, some philosophers, some freethinkers, thought that science and reason and knowledge was the best thing that could happen to the humanity. They believe in the knowledge for the sake of knowledge. But we have to bear in mind that there are some irrational factors behind this sake for knowledge. And the will for power is one of them, as Nietzsche reminded. So we have to consider that science is like a new religion, like the Catholic Church or many religions, that for the Catholic Church it's not important whether God exists or not. The Catholic Church is a business. It's a business with a hierarchy, and the important thing is to maintain the structure. For science, the objective is not producing something that will illuminate the world, to illuminate the humanity. The important thing of science is to keep themselves alive as an organization, to have a lot of students and to have more power and more funds. Another example of reflection that I like, it is a personal selection, is about Unamuno. I introduced Unamuno, a Spanish philosopher, at the beginning of my presentation. I agree that truth in science may be universal, but the interest for this science is not universal. And we have to consider that science is not everything. Unamuno wrote in a letter to another philosopher, to Ortega y Gasset, the following thing, talking about science. Do they invent things? Invent them. Electric light is here as good as in the place where it was invented. On the one hand, science, with its applications, is useful for making life easier. This is the part for applied science. On the other hand, it is useful to open a new door to the wisdom. And are there no other doors? Have not we another one? He was referring to Spain, because Spain traditionally was not very attached to science. There were not important scientists in Spain before the 20th century. And there were many pressures in Europe that you say, oh, Spain, you have to be like Germany, you have to be like France, like UK, producing good science, because this is what is important nowadays. And Unamuno, under these things, they says, okay, science is a product of your culture. We have other products of our culture. There are many expressions of our culture. Science is not everything. There are many ways to do a civilization, apart from the applications, I mean. Another, and the third one that I would like to mention, this is very connected with the topic that I have here, the twilight of the scientific age. This is Oswald Spengler, German philosopher and historian. And his masterpiece, The Decline of the West, is a pessimistic view of how the societies are not forever, and the Western society in particular is declining. According to Spengler, cultures are like organisms in which there is a birth, a growth, reproduction, and death, all of them with some symptoms which are recognizable. And comparing the history of Western culture already 1 century ago, this book was published around 1 century ago, comparing the history of Western culture with that of other civilizations, we can see that it is declining. It is reaching the end of its possibilities. According to Spengler, these are not my words, art is death, already in the beginning of 20th century, philosophy is death, and science is in the way. Here we have indeed one quotation by Spengler. Death of science consists of the existence of nobody able to live it. But 200 years of scientific orgies get fed up in the end. It is not the individual, but the spirit of a culture who gets fed up. And this is manifest by sending to the historical world of nowadays researchers who are more and more small, mean, narrow, and infecund. In my opinion, Spengler was a little bit before the time of this, because even this book published in 1923, we are talking about the development of quantum mechanics, Einstein, and still big science was being created in the 20th century. However, if we take this sentence and we place it nowadays, it makes sense. It's true. We are making a activity, but not something mean, something narrow, something infecund. So it makes more sense 1 century before. Another aspect is that the decline of science is not science or civilization of a culture. It's not something that happens in a short period. Usually it takes long periods. For instance, if we compare with the decline of the Western Roman Empire, according to Edward Gibbon, this book published in the 18th century, it took around 3 centuries to the decline, because the decline of the Roman Empire started in the 2nd century of our era, and the fall of the empire was in the 5th century. So the decline is something very slow. It's not something that suddenly there is a collapse, abrupt collapse, and the civilization disappears. There is a declination, a declination, a declination. We may remain 2 or 3 centuries just going down. Here I have another considerations, but I don't want to spend much more time. Summing up, my point of view that I wanted to express, to share with you here, is that we don't live in a dark age of science, not yet, but we are in the way to a dark way. We are in the twilight. Twilight means this is a twilight, that the sun is close to the sunset. After there is a sunset, there will be the dark age, like it happens in the Middle Age. So, but we cannot know when it will happen. Maybe it will take half a century or 200 years. We don't know. We are in this direction, but we don't know the future. How will be the far future? Who knows? Possibly, if we observe how happens in the past, it will be something similar to the Middle Age, in which the culture was preserved in some monasteries or some places. I suppose that we will preserve some of our wisdom of science, in particular in the future. Not everything will be lost. My guess is that research will find some end. There will be a moment in which scientists will say, okay, we cannot do any more science because science is becoming more and more expensive. We have a limit. We have to stop to do science. But all the wisdom accumulated during many centuries will be preserved. I hope so. And if we go to the very, very far future, maybe in 1,000, 2,000 years, possibly the future civilizations will contemplate us as we contemplate the Greek civilization or the old civilizations. Within some centuries, humankind will contemplate the ruins of our civilizations in the same way that Romantic poets contemplated the ruins of past cultures, with the sweet allure of decay, death, and destruction. Science will prompt an emotional response again and will be revived. Possibly there will be a new renaissance in the future. It's impossible to predict. But among all, I want to express that science is a characteristic of a society in an epoch and in some place. It's not something forever. Possibly there are oscillations. There was science among the Greeks in the 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. Later it disappeared, the science, and in the modern epoch appears again this interest in the Western society. And nowadays even we can do science in China or in other societies away from the Western countries. But it's just a manifestation of our culture. What is permanent is the anthropological point of view here. We are human beings producing revolutions, new ideas, and science is just an idea. No? This is all that I have to say so far. We can discuss the points that you want. And just to remind that there is a book about this question, if somebody wants to read something else, some more details.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martín or Dr. López-Corredoira, we say, about this very interesting and inspiring speech about the Twilight, which is a new aspect in some sense after the highlights. And we have here nice amount of auditorium. Is there any spontaneous questions now to start the discussion?
So what is your
microphone? Aha. Tuomo, sun tulla, start.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I recognize familiar things. Well, so what is your advice to get forward from the situation we are today? How to get young people's ideas better appreciated and avoid let's say the big mass truth, how do you call it? You want to call it institutionalization, that big institutions are driving the science. And so what is your advice? How to get new ideas into the light?
I'm not a politician, not even a politician of science. It's not in my hands to propose anything. Of course, if we touch any of these small topics that I have been talking about, we can discuss and we can find solutions. There are solutions, for instance, about the peer review system or other systems, making the science more open, less dependent on the economy. But forgetting about the particular points, just the general view, I think there is nothing to do. This is like the view that it was in the past, the materialism, the historical materialism by Marx or whatever. The history has one direction and the history is pushing us. We cannot modify the history. If all the manifestations of culture have some increase, have some golden age, and there is some decrease. And this is how is life. This is how is the life of the societies. We cannot avoid the decline of the societies. We can delay it, of course, and we can modify some aspects, and we can take some particular country and apply some different policies and make it something better. But the general thing, the general impression, taking into account all the points that I have touched here, that the science is becoming more expensive, we are too many doing science. I would say that this is a consequence of the history of science. Science was a successful enterprise. We were very successful as a society. We have reached something great in science, and due to this success, we realize that we cannot do it anything better, so we have to die. It's like life. It's like, what is the solution if a person says, well, you are going to die because you have 100 years old. Well, you have 100 years old, you are going to die. What, I have not any magical solution. We are an old society, an exhausted society, and as a society, this is our future. As I say, I repeat again, this is not for tomorrow. Maybe it happens in 1 century, whatever. The point is that all societies, if you analyze the history of China, the history of India, all societies has going up and going down. We cannot modify the history. One individual cannot modify the history. It's just a conglomeration of circumstances that move in this direction. The circumstance nowadays is that our science is very good. We understand many things. Okay. So in order to do a better science, you need to put more money and more money and more money. And once you enter in these dynamics, there is no way out. You are lost. You know that in the end you will reach the end because you have not infinite money, but there is not any other way. I agree that we can do many things much better. For instance, allowing the students, the young researchers, to have more free time, to reduce the pressure of publication, not to publish so much. So there are many things we can do in particularly, but this is like a small delay in our declination. This is not going to change everything because we are in the place that we are because we are pushed by the history to occupy this position because of the success of our science. It's not only the science. If we change the topic, it's not my topic because I'm not a specialist in everything, but if we talk about music, for instance, or arts, why don't we have here a Beethoven, a Mozart? There are reasons, of course. You can analyze the history of arts, but one of the things is that the level is so high that it's very, very difficult to improve what it is. And what we can do is doing repetitions. In science happens something similar. Just producing something totally new is becoming more and more difficult. And I know you disagree because you are one exception within science. I know you are producing interesting new ideas, but you are, as I say, you are not the general case. There are, in general, the science is not. I wish everybody will be like you, dedicated to really putting the effort in thinking ideas. This is the right direction. I agree. But possibly, with your experience, you will agree that there are a lot of difficulties of people like you to defend these ideas, because it's a system. Science nowadays is a system permeated to new ideas just to protect the status quo of some other people, because many people have a lot of money and their families live off this money. So it's like a new church. Science has become a new church, and it's very difficult to fight against the church, as was demonstrated in the last 2,000 years with the Catholic Church. What can we do? Just waiting for the new revolution in the future. Maybe there will be a new cultural revolution, but one individual cannot do anything. And even the president of a country cannot do anything, I will say. It's like capitalism. What can we do against capitalism? Because the key of the question is our society as a whole, the economic system. We know that many problems that we have nowadays, particularly the global warming, are due to our way of society. We're consuming too much, producing too much. What can we do? Well, stopping the war, but how do we stop the war? Are we going to convince now everybody, the Chinese and the Americans, and that just stop your machines, don't produce mobiles, everybody at home, don't take flights? You will not be successful, because people are irrational. People, they don't look the global civilization. They look their own interests, the benefits for themselves, for their families. Human beings are egoistic, and this is a consequence of all that. So. Again, a remark, no, I have no any magical solution. It's decline, because it has to decline. It's like Spengler when he said the decline of the West. He was not proposing any political ideas just to avoid the decline of the West. It was just an observation. I observe the world, and I observe that it's declining. Don't ask me what I can do to stop the world. It's like this. We cannot avoid the decline. It's like life. You cannot avoid life, the birth and death. Is the fate of our civilization for a far future.
Yeah. Second question.
Anastasia, yeah, thank you very much. And thank you so much for your honesty, intellectual honesty. You're also, in this sense, more of a special case rather than the general kind of stance. And that's why I think that philosophers are, as myself as a philosopher of science, we are responsible for what's happening very much. Because instead of kind of asking questions and producing some normative claims, I think philosophy of science became the same production of papers and grants and institutionalization and so on. So there's a very disturbing kind of part of development, and I agree with your pessimism here. But otherwise I wouldn't be doing my PhD in philosophy of science if I thought there are no optimistic things at all. So one good thing, which you also mentioned when you now said, Thomas Winkler, that there are some approaches, and usually alternative approaches to physics and cosmology, that are still kind of holding on to the idea of finding the truth about the natural world and describing it. And so in that sense, I think for me, like an example of the idea that was after already the Second World War would be like Milgram's idea. So the modified Newtonian dynamics and the whole like Mondial research group. Now, the thing is that the philosophical defense of that position is usually using the same things you are like suggesting not to use, like falsification and so on. So my question is, as a philosopher of science who tries to change the situation even though there is almost like very little hope, and like you say that you should use kind of the ideas from the classical philosophy, right? But the problem is that most of the philosophy that is used by, and like, at least thought of by people who work in alternative cosmology, is the modern, like, well, modern in the sense that it's mid-20th century philosophy of science. So would you say that the best solution would be to kind of neglect it and go all the way back somewhere, like, I don't know, to 18th century, 17th century, and so on, in order to provide a defense for the alternative approaches? Or, like, is there still any sense to use modern methodology of science to kind of compare the theoretical stances that you have?
Well, there are different questions, no? There are different topics in your position. Of course, you may have your position and possibly I disagree, but the question is not whether we agree or not. The philosophy of science has important things, no doubt, but it's a small branch of philosophy. This tradition of creating these small compartments of philosophy, like a specialized philosophy, is just an emulation of the scientific system in some sense. And this comes mainly from the Anglo-Saxon world. And it's different from the tradition of what is called the continental philosophy. So I was explaining to you before starting the talk, the main two philosophies that are nowadays, the main traditions, I will say, because philosophy is not only one school, there are many traditions that come from the past, is the continental philosophy, I mean the German philosophers, the French philosophers, which are in general, they are philosophers who try to understand everything. They are systems in general, not talking about science alone, but they talk about ethics, they talk about philosophy of nature, philosophy of science. So all together and giving sense, because this is perhaps the major advantage nowadays of the philosophy, is that trying to connect everything, the human existence, of course, the history, the classical philosophers, the idea, and well, this is one way to do philosophy. The other way, as you say, is just, okay, I am a specialist in philosophy, not only philosophy of science, I know people who are philosophy of cosmology. Even within philosophy of cosmology, there are people who are hyper-specialized, and there are philosophers of simulations in cosmology. So they are specialists in interpreting the embodied simulations in the computer, and they dedicate 10, 20 years only to understand the simulations. For me, this is emulating the scientific system, and it's interesting. No? I do not deny the interest of that, but we could not forget the rest. We cannot forget ever a philosopher. A scientist can do it, but a philosopher should not forget that the important thing is the whole, giving sense to the existence. So you cannot separate the ethics from the aesthetics, from the metaphysics, from the nature. You cannot make compartments. Otherwise, you become a scientist, and then you have the same problems, of course. And you recognize, and I know also because I have colleagues in departments of philosophy, that it's an imitation of the system. They have the same peer review system, the same kind of conference. They publish even in English, because in the past there were many publications in German, in French. But now English, if you become a philosopher of science, yeah, English is your language. Well, this is a narrow way of observing the reality. It's valid, but for me it's a little bit lacks of a human point of view. There is the humanity. It's becoming too technical, possibly about questions about logics, about analytical philosophy, philosophy of mind. There are many technical questions, even connected with neuroscience, but this is becoming just a small appendix of the science. It's not doing a humanistic approach. It's not the big tradition of Hegel or Kant or Schopenhauer or Plato or Spinoza or so. This is what I think we have to read. I'm not claiming also that we should read 18th century philosophy. No, there are also important philosophers in the 20th century. But better to read the important ones, the people who have some system of philosophy, the important thinkers, because nowadays we have an excess of information, not only in science, but also in philosophy. And sometimes we are lost with details. One advantage of philosophy is that we are able to approach, to see the ocean just in a look. No? We don't need to get deeper and deeper like scientists just to know everything about 50 square meters of the ocean. No, we want to have a look at the whole ocean and connect everything. And philosophy is fresh air for our mind. I encourage people to read philosophy, of course, even modern philosophy, 20th century philosophers, there are important philosophers. But I do not agree this narrow mind way of doing philosophy. Let's do a department of philosophy or logics of the... a philosopher is a philosopher. Forget about philosopher of. No, there are no philosophers of, there are philosophers only. Philosophers who are worried about understanding the meaning of the existence and what we should do, what is the nature of the universe. Otherwise, you are not a philosopher. You are just an academician, just making a curriculum, and to get your position, which is becoming a bureaucrat, like most of the scientists. It's the same story.
And one thing, the reason for that is only, like, it's not epistemic reason, but it's only the kind of mythological, historical context of the whole, like North American influence in your view. Like, this is kind of the reason for this over-specialization and like institutionalization and this production of...
Well, in science, the specialization was already in the last 2 centuries. Remember that before Kant, before 18th century, most of the philosophers were scientists and scientists were philosophers. There was no distinction between science and philosophy. There was a break between science and philosophy, mostly due because the growth of science was so much that nobody was able to become a specialist of everything. So it was necessary. Already 2 centuries ago was necessary, the specialization. What is new after the Second World War is more the way of working, more American, more of the big projects, especially after think about the Manhattan Project or the atomic bomb. This way of producing science with big money, you know? And this idea that in order to do good science, you have to put a lot of money. This idea of associating money with science and neglecting people, for instance, personally, I know many good scientists working in India, for instance. It's a country with very good scientists, in Russia, in China. But they are not American, and they are not in big groups, and they have no mass media, and they don't produce press release every small discovery, so they cannot compete with the rest of the people because they are not in the capitalist way of producing science. America has contributed to make science more capitalist, to introduce the industrial system of production. They produce cars in the same way that they produce science, the same mentality, just pragmatic. But they have not made science, and they have not made specialization. This was previous to that. No?
My name is Simo Salo. As you have written a book in this problem area, I wonder, have you written any advice in that book? How to stop the trend or how to slow down the trend? Is there any hope for that?
Well, in this I have replied to Tuomo before about that. In this, yes, I have a section in the end, the last section of the last chapter. I give some advices, but just few details. I do not expect to somebody read the advices and say, okay, let's apply this and we will stop the decline of science. No, it's not like that. History. The thing is that we are a society, Europe especially, America not so much, but Europe is an old society. We are, like all civilizations, we become exhausted. We have not the same illusion that in the past. In every aspect. I mean, possibly many centuries ago, people were more patriot, for instance, defending the countries of Europe. If there is a war, there were a lot of volunteers. Yes, I want to go to the war because we have to fight. Now, people, if they have the possibility, they will escape if there is any conflict. They don't want. there is also a society that has become very, very pragmatic due to the American influence, but also due to the. This happens in all rich societies, in some sense. Spengler speaks about it many times, about how the societies decline. The cycle is always the same. First, in a civilization, we have a group of people that is fighting for survival, because they need to feed their families, they need to create factories, they need to do something, and they have illusions. But then the societies become very rich. Europe has become a very rich society, a very prosperous society, and then people relax because they are rich, and they say, okay, now we are going to work less hours. The Chinese people will work for us, so let's relax. Yes, it's like this, and now we don't want to go to the war. Let's ask the Ukrainians to fight with the Russians. We don't send our sons. This already happens in this. If you read the history of the Roman Empire, how was produced the collapse of the Roman Empire, it was something like that. It was a very prosperous society, but it was so prosperous, and there were so many citizens with many rights that they were very comfortable. They don't want to fight. They don't want to conquer new frontiers. Even if they have some song in the Roman Empire, I mean, they cut the thumbs of the sons, because in this way they don't go to the army, just to avoid sending the sons to the army. So this is what happens in the rich societies. They become weak. Rich societies become weak, and this is the way of the decadence. And this is something that has happened many times in history. I put the Roman Empire example because it's very well known, but there are many other examples of fall down of many empires. How we can stop the exhaustion of our society is the same question of how we can stop some 100-year-old person become old. No, it's the biology, it's a process. You cannot stop the time. It's something that will happen sooner or later. Maybe I think maybe in my generation, I'm middle age, maybe I will not see the collapse of the Western society. Maybe it will be in 100 years or not, but it's clear that we go in this direction, not only in science, in art. Our art is rubbish. You go to a museum of contemporary art, it's pure rubbish. People just, a lot of, they talk too much, but they don't produce anything valuable or very, very few things. Science is just an industry that creates a lot of employment, a lot of noise, but in the end, the most important science was produced a long time ago, and everything goes in this direction. It's just a lot of economical activity, people who with a lot of rights, they don't want to make an effort, they don't fight for anything. Well, this is the way to the collapse of the society. There is no option.
Thank you.
Thank you very much about all the questions. Now we have only a few minutes because we have to clean the
Yes, if I can.
And I would like to say something at the end. Around hundreds years ago, Oswald Spengler was visiting Helsinki and Finland and
Yes.
promoting his book like you today, and it was around 1918 when the first versions were
The first part, yes.
and then among the listeners were in the golden age of Finnish art and science some important persons like architect Elien Saarinen, who said that Oswald Spengler was the most important inspiration source for him, and he developed an art education system in Cranbrook, USA, wrote a book about design, the search for form, and then the city, discussing the start, development, and decade of American cities and cities in general. So I think that now we have the opportunity to get inspirations from this very
I hope.
excellent book with synthesize both science, the big aspects and philosophical views, but in some sense it maybe is a little bit an art book, a very good book, an artifact, and has some literature ambitions. So thank you for that, inviting it in that way also. So what do you think about the unification of cultures? Or that will it be some kind of, not science dominating alone, but some symbiosis with art and politics and science, giving the new basis of the continuation after that in the Twilight? We don't know. You said you are not a prophet. You don't say nothing how it goes, but it is very important that you said that we don't know.
Yeah, is your comment?
No, short comment, and then we have to close in a couple of minutes.
Yes. No, well, I did not know that Spengler was here. That's nice to know. I know, of course, in the times of Spengler, this Decline of the West was a kind of bestseller in Germany in the 20s, especially because Germany lost the First World War, and many Germans have found some sense in this Decline of the West. Of course, there are many exaggerations. Spengler dedicates a lot of pages to talk about the architecture. It's true. I remember maybe 200 pages or so, yeah, and gives a lot of details, just claiming that the end of the architecture was in the 18th century or 18th or 19th century. After that, everything was a repetition. He did not consider the Eiffel Tower or something like that. These kinds of constructions as relevant. He says that the most important technical things in architecture were already developed sometimes. And it's true that sometimes later in the 20th century there were some new developments that have contradicted these things. No, it's not always that it's finished. Well, we never know where it is finished. Maybe tomorrow, I'm talking about science, but maybe tomorrow Tuomo is recognized as the new Einstein, and we have a new physics here. I cannot tell you about that. But what we can see is what is the trend in the last years. But sometimes the history has some fluctuations. It's not something flat going. Maybe it's going down, but suddenly there is an abrupt. There is something extraordinary. And it changes the direction. Now, I was talking about the American influence, but possibly in the future, America will not be the leader of the world. Maybe China or maybe the Muslim countries or whatever will introduce a new mentality, neither better nor worse, it's a new mentality. And this will feed a new way to see the nature and new philosophies. And maybe we have some revival of science and art in a different direction. What is true is that a society, isolated Western society, Europe, US, if you leave them alone and without interaction with other civilizations, well, they are not forever. Nothing is forever. And the history teaches us that there are empires that go up, go down, and then they are replaced by other empires that impose new ideas, because science, art are ideas. What is permanent is the human beings, but the rest is a culture, and the culture is not permanent forever. So yes, it's 1 minute left now.
Thank you.
You are welcome very much.
1 minute, 2 minutes. Do you like to have 1 minute more?
How?
Do you like to have a couple of minutes more?
Yes, sure, as you want. I'm here. I'm not exhausted. And we are here like in a small family. We are 3 people, so we can.
But now maybe our 5 minutes are now end. So May the 2nd. Thank you.